Welcome to the Hippodrome, an important Category A listed building in the heart of Bo'ness and believed to be the oldest purpose-built cinema in Scotland. The Scottish Historic Buildings Trust has owned this building since 1996 and under our care completed a £2.1 million restoration project which finished in 2009. The Hippodrome is an important example of the work of the Scottish Historic Buildings Trust and the impact that we can have on local communities.
One of the most interesting things about working with the Hippodrome was its clear connection between the community and what was happening to the building. There was a real interest in the future of the construction. I've been involved with the project for quite a long time, including the period when the building was completely neglected and appeared to have been totally abandoned. I'll always remember standing outside this building, making notes and doing some of the survey work. We would be approached by people not looking to complain about the condition of it or asking for it to be knocked down, but basically asking when it was going to reopen. And there's still that very clear connection between what people remember. Their associations with the building are really good. They remember coming to see films, they remember coming to the bingo as well, but for a very long period, right the way through until the 1970s. And that remained part of Bo'ness's culture and wasn't just a memory, it was something that lots and lots of people really wanted to see happen again. Unfortunately, the Hippodrome, that's what we've been able to do. The collaboration that went on with the Hippodrome, as far as we can make out, it seems to have been two key drivers. One being the promoter, Louis Dixon. Now, Louis was local to Bo'ness. He'd been making films of the local area and showing other films in halls in the town prior to the Hippodrome. However, he obviously reached a stage by 1910, 1911 where he really wanted to invest in a purpose-built venue. He got together with his friend Matt Steele. Now, Matt had also come from Bo'ness. He'd moved away, he'd gone through to Glasgow, trained as an architect, and came back to Bo'ness. And curiously, during the rest of his career, he worked pretty much exclusively in the town, designing what are now recognised as some of the area's finest buildings and most unusual buildings as well. So Matt and Louis must have got together and looked at what was happening on the continent, what was maybe happening in America as well, and drew on that to come up with a building that is really quite unusual in terms of early cinema constructions. The Hippodrome is very specifically built as a cinema, and we often refer to it as Scotland's earliest purpose-built cinema, and it was just that. So if you look back at the drawings that we've got, the archived drawings by Matt Steele, dated 1911, all of those drawings are titled Picture Palace, and that's exactly what this was intended to be. The Hippodrome was a palace for showing pictures rather than a venue that might do lots of other things. He was very clear in his intent in doing that. SHBT bought the Hippodrome in, I think, 1996. And at the time, it was a little bit controversial for the Trust. The Trust had been involved largely in buildings that were perhaps very fine and highly recognised, pieces of 18th century architecture, for example, whereas the Hippodrome then was a little bit recent. It looked a little bit like a normal Art Deco cinema, of which there were lots throughout the country. However, the Trust saw and recognised that it was something that little bit special. When the building was purchased, it was in really appalling condition. Although it had been used right the way through until the late 1970s, with bingo use latterly replacing cinema, the condition of the building had deteriorated relatively quickly, and in particular, all of the flat-roofed areas around the outside of the big circular auditorium drum had been letting water in quite catastrophically. There'd also been a really bad dry rot outbreak in the auditorium here itself. And the decision had been taken at that time to strip out most of the interior of the auditorium on the ground floor. However, apart from that, the building had pretty much been abandoned and closed up. So it was very derelict on the ground floor. You could come in, you were walking over joists, the bare floor was exposed. but upstairs and in all of the other little rooms you could see what the cinema had been. The toilets were all intact, the projection room was exactly as it had been left when the last film had been shown pretty much, and lots of other areas and little gems, nuggets of the building's past could be seen as well. Once the user was established for the building, it was going to be a cinema and Falkirk Council was willing to take it on. The Trust worked with the Council to put together a package of funding to see that happen. It was a tricky job, but it was made all the easier because the Heritage Lottery Fund introduced a project scheme which basically focused on areas rather than individual buildings. Now, the Hippodrome fitted in perfectly within an area-based scheme, a townscape heritage initiative that would cover the centre of Bo'ness. So ultimately the building found itself at the centre of a wider regeneration scheme that both enabled funding to come to the building to repair, convert the interior, but also to improve the landscape around it. And some of the other buildings in the area as well were repaired as part of that scheme. While technically it might seem obvious to go from cinema use to cinema use, this caused a number of problems, first of which was the acoustics. When the Hippodrome opened, it was intended that films would be accompanied by musicians, often a pianist, although at the Hippodrome there was a band pit. So sound was quite lively, lots of echo was what was required. Cinema now, however, is really a very dead, silent, subdued box, and the sound that you hear is dependent entirely on speakers placed around the auditorium and behind the screen as well. So we had to try and incorporate the modern facilities for sound, Dolby surround sound for example, in a space which was really quite echoey and is also circular, which architecturally causes all kinds of problems in focusing sound in areas that you might not expect. So we worked quite closely with an acoustic consultant to try and bring the liveliness of the space down. So we started using some acoustic materials in the ceiling, for example, and in the balcony front to try and deaden the sound. And we also tried to stop some of the sound leaking to the outside. We took a quite conscious decision to try and retain as much of the internal finishes, fixtures as we possibly could. That included things like light fittings outside the toilets, the ladies and gents signs. In fact, the whole interiors of the toilets, all the fittings with their cracks and dents and such like, and the chrome pipework, all of that was brought back in and reused. I'm sure that one of the key elements in any cinema that you go to are the seats, and it's not just the very obvious thing of how comfortable they are. It's the appearance of them, the associations of them as well, and that sort of memory, in particular in an old cinema, people tend to remember where they would sit when they would see a film, or what they were up to while they were watching that film on those seats as well. So what we've got in the Hippodrome now is a combination of new seating, which is in the character of the older seats as we had previously, but we've also been able to salvage many of the balcony seats and to reintroduce them. One of the elements that we put a lot of work into at the Hippodrome was the analysis of the decorative scheme for the interior of the building. Obviously at the time it was operating as a cinema, it was largely dark inside and people weren't taking photographs, and we weren't able to find any early photographs of what the interior had been. We therefore used specialist consultants to analyse the decoration as it had been, so effectively to go back down through the layers and find both what the original scheme had been and what subsequent alterations had involved. The original scheme in the building had been really quite striking, but quite dark. So the interior of the auditorium appears to have been quite a dark green, but with quite eye-catching silver, gold, gilt elements, stencil work, checkerboard patterns around the proscenium. I thought it was fantastic. However, it's a bit of a dilemma in trying to reproduce a scheme of that nature from the pre-war, pre-First World War period, being so much alteration had been carried out to the building. that it would have been pretty deceptive, and we would have had to have made up a lot of the areas where subsequent changes had taken place. So we took a decision to go for a scheme that we knew had been introduced in the 1920s, when the balcony had been altered, the roof had been altered, the flat roof had been replaced with a pitched roof. And that scheme was quite different in character. The collaboration between Matt and Louis must have continued. They must have changed their own views as to what they were doing, and they've altered it to a scheme which was really quite dark to one which is quite light but uses contrasting colours. So you can now see the interior as we have it, with the purples, the rich purple colour, yellows, oranges and the browns, and also blues. It seems like an odd combination, but it's very much of that character from the 1920s. And it includes a sunburst above the proscenium. We knew that there had been a sunburst as part of the original scheme from our analysis, but it had also been overlaid with a subsequent and slightly larger sunburst effect in the 1920s, and we were able to reinstate that as well. Looking back at the Hippodrome as project architect for it, I have very fond memories of the whole process of getting the building back into use. But it's slightly curious from my point of view, because it's not a building that I've just passed on and never been back to or made very, very occasional visits to. I've come to the Hippodrome numerous occasions, including to the silent film festivals that have been held every year since. Falkirk Council and then the Community Trust have made a real effort to get the Hippodrome back to a state where it's probably the country's best known venue for classic film. The Silent Film Festival is a case in point. It attracts people from all over the world to come to this special little building, but at the same time come back the week after and there will still be a full auditorium of people who are local to the building, who still see it as their cinema. So it's still Bo'ness's own little gem. It's operated for the people and pretty much by the people as well. There's locals work in the building and they use it. They genuinely do come here week on, week out.
Clearly the unique selling point of the Hippodrome is that it's Scotland's oldest purpose-built cinema, but I really think that the other USP about the Hippodrome is the warm welcome that you get here. So when you come across the threshold, you'll be greeted with a smile. It's very friendly, and it very much recalls the approach that Louis Dixon, the original proprietor, took, because he would always be at the door dressed in his fine suit, welcoming everybody, all his audience in. And in fact, he's very much associated in the local mind with the Hippodrome, so some people still call the Hippodrome Dixon's in tribute to Louis. And I think Louis would be really proud and glad that we were nominated by hundreds of people across Scotland before the pandemic for the Hospitality Awards, and we actually walked away with the prize for the best cinema experience in Scotland. And I think that's not just because of the fantastic building and the programme and the great projection and sound quality, but it's very much also to do with the really warm welcome that you get here. And in fact, our strapline is cinema with a warm welcome. Thanks to the restoration of the building and the operation of the building as this glorious picture palace, we really can look forward to welcoming cinema goers to the Hippodrome for generations to come.